Hi there and good morning. We are back today for our final video of our Deck the Hall project. And we've really run through this one pretty quickly, but here we are today and we're going to be talking about getting the quilt bound. So join me right after this and I'll give you all the details of what I have done and show you what we're going to do today. Let's get it finished, shall we? And welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Okay, let's get started. Now, couple of housekeeping issues first. This Deck the Halls quilt is coming out of the book Vintage Christmas. It's written by Lori Holt of the Bee in My Bonnet Company. And the block that we used is holly and ivy, and that can be found in the book. And then the layout for this is essentially what's in the book. We've just changed up the size of that border on the edge significantly. But you will be able to see what that looks like, and all of your measurements and cutting and any type of sewing instructions that I may not have covered here would be in the book, right? Well, first of all, let's talk about the quilt top a little bit, and then we'll move into that. The quilt top, like I said, is 12 of the holly and ivy blocks, and they've been put together with this candy stripe sashing. And then I added a small border on the edge. And it is not anywhere near the size of the border in the book because I did not want this quilt that large. I specifically wanted something that I could machine quilt, and I needed to keep it smaller. So that's where we are. Now, how did I quilt it, you're going to ask me. We used the warm and white batting on this, and warm and white has a 10-inch minimum spacing for the stitching to make sure that the batting doesn't shift and it performs as expected. So I did some simple machine quilting, and I can always go back even after it's bound and put more stitching in if I like. What did I do? I stitched a seam, a quilting seam, along the edge of the sashing, both inside on the on the white, and then through the corner blocks just to follow that line along. And then I came in so that we didn't have this large expanse of unquilted fabric and stitched a square, and that square just simply ran from the point of these little holly leaves to the other. So there's a square right there. And that's all of the quilting I did except for a line just around the green border. That's all the quilting. Easy, didn't take very long at all. I think I did most of that in an afternoon. And then the last thing I did was I stitched along the edge of the quilt and trimmed it. And I stitched just inside the green fabric with a very long stitch. I just want something that's going to hold it together. So when we apply that binding, we're applying a binding to a quilt. We're not applying a binding to a quilt top, a batting, and a backing. I want them all joined together so it's an easy join. So that's our quilt as it is right now. And it is still, I am still just tickled pink with the way that looks. So let's talk a little bit about our binding. We don't have any curves on this. We don't have any details we're trying to capture. It's just a rectangular quilt. So I chose not to go with a bias binding. I went with a straight grain of fabric with the fabric binding for this. It's easy, it's simple, and you can whip it out much faster than you can a bias because you don't have to cut all the angles. So I have a little piece of scrap fabric here that I just wanted to demonstrate or show you how that goes together. Because if you're cutting with the fabric, which is what most of us would do unless we have a long piece and we want a long continuous binding, which we could, that would mean less seams. But usually we want to preserve our selvages and we cut with the fabric. So here's an example of that. And the way I put those binding strips together is I'll cut them out. I'll put them right sides facing each other. And then I'm going to position them or draw a line 1/4 inch, excuse me, 1/4 inch away from the edge of the fabric. So I've got a line here and I've got a line here. And then I'm going to position those two pieces on top so that that line is where the two fabrics meet. There we go. Let me put another pin in that so it will stay. Okay, and then I'm going to draw a diagonal line from the point where the fabric meets on this side to the point where the fabric meets on this side. And then I'm going to stitch along that line. And I'm going to do that now because I want you to see what it looks like. You don't line up those fabrics with the edges together because that will cause you problems. Whoops, I've got my machine turned down real slow. Let's turn it up. I think my bobbin is askew because it's making all kind of noise, and look at that bird's nest back there. But we'll get that straightened out. I don't think it's going to matter. So now I've got that stitch line right here. And when I take the pins out, and open it up, our binding is put together. And if we trim off those little, I'm going to call them dog ears, and trim our seam, this is not pressed, but that's what it looks like. And that's without trying to match that seam. If we were interested in making it match perfectly, we could have adjusted it a little bit, and we still could, but you can see. The reason we do the seams at an angle like that is because they will lay flatter when we're working on our binding. Now, I've chosen to do a double fold binding or a French fold binding for this quilt. I don't think it's going to get a whole lot of use compared to a quilt that may be on a bed all year because it is a holiday quilt. So I don't think we need a bias for the extra durability or the flexibility. I think the straight of grain is going to work fine. So once we have all those strips together, then we're going to fold them in half and press it down. And you can make this binding any size you wanted. You could make it much wider, you could make it skinnier. That would be your choice. So we are going to be binding this in this red polka dot fabric. And I made this a couple of days ago, so let me see. This was a 3-inch strip that I sewed together using the diagonal seams like I just showed you, and then folded it in half and pressed it. So we've got a folded edge and 2 raw edges. Now, let's get started, shall we? I've rolled it up, and the way I roll this up was I just used one of these rulers and rolled it around and then pulled the ruler out. If you've got some kind of spool system, that would work great as well. Then you don't have to worry about kind of monitoring this while you're sewing. But for now, I think I'm just going to put a pin in the end That'll kind of hold it while we get started. Now, a couple of things. You can sew this entirely on by machine. You could sew it entirely on by hand. I choose to go somewhere in the middle. I usually sew it on by machine, and then when I fold it over to sew it to the other side, I sew it by hand. And usually how I do that is to sew it on the back side. That would be our multicolor polka dot here. And then when I flip it over, I'm going to be hand sewing it to the front. Now this was 3 inches, so now it's 1.5 inches. So if we sew it down with about 1/2 inch seam allowance, when we fold it over, it'll be about 1/2 inch on the front. What I do find, however, is doing that in the front is never quite 1/2 inch. So you've got a choice. You can either bring it out and not match it exactly with the edge. Can you see that there? Yes. So you have a little bit of a gap, or you can just leave it at the edge and sew a little bit narrower seam allowance. And the other thing that I will tell you, especially now that I've got a little bit more experience with this, is I used to not worry too much about the batting and materials that were going inside the binding. And what I found was, from time to time, my binding would be too big, and I would end up with a nice, I don't want to say fluffy because that gives you the wrong idea, but a nice cushioned quilt. But the binding was so wide that there was no cushion in the middle. So don't make your binding too wide. You want to make sure that it's got material in it and it's nicely filled. I think, I've never done a quilt for judging, but I think that that is one of the things that quilt judges will look at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to position this just slightly off the edge. And when I say that, I mean probably 1/8 of an inch or less. And I'm going to put a few pins in here. You want to make sure you don't pull on your binding either. It's not going to stretch because it's not biased, but it will misshapen it a little bit. And I think you'll find that if you do that, you'll run into issues when you flip it over to turn. So I'm just going to put a couple of pins in here. We may need to adjust as we sew. Now we want to leave a tail, and I'm probably going to leave a 6 inch or more tail here so that we have a place to join those pieces of binding. Couldn't get my words together there. Now, it's a big quilt and it's going to have to be rustled a bit, but we will manage that. Now, we're going to have larger than a 1/4 inch seam, so we can't use our 1/4 inch foot. So we have to figure out a different way. Now, do we want to use our walking foot? We might. Maybe we should do that. There it is. I'll have to swap that out quickly. It's probably a good thing I checked because that wasn't even very tight. Goodness. And remember, when you're putting your walking foot on, you want to hold that little arm up so it sits on top of the screw in there. Sometimes an old-fashioned tool is very handy. I'm using an old-fashioned seam guide to place right along the edge of my foot, and that will keep my fabric from drifting over to the right and taking too big of a bite out of that seam. Now I can see it's lined up just perfectly. Now I'm using a 2.4 stitch, a regular straight stitch. And we are going to back stitch. And we're going to have to stop periodically and reposition everything. Make sure that our fabrics are all right where we want them to be. Now the walking foot is doing most of the work for me, but I am guiding it. I want to keep it straight. That's the biggest concern that I have. Okay, I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to unpin these. And you can see here we've got that stitch down about 3/8 from the edge, and if we flip it over and flip it back in. Okay, now the way we've got this set up, that's the way it's going to look. That's going to give us 1.5 inches green binding. And this one is 2 inches. I think that's going to work fine. I was a little concerned about that being too much of a wrap around to the front, but I think that the bigger binding is going to work well. And sometimes you just have to double check what you're doing to make sure it's going to be what you like. And don't rush. If you're not sure, stop. Because at this point we've got a foot sewn. It's easy to rip out, it's easy to move. Anything you need to do, you can do it. But if you sew the whole thing on and decide you don't like it, you're going to be unhappy. So let's don't do that. Let's make sure, like I just did by checking that we're going to be happy with the way that looks. So you can see that. Because if we really want it to look more like this, our binding is not going to have anything in it. So it really needs to come over just about like that. And when we're sewing this, when I'm hand sewing it, I'm going to have a ruler with me checking that we're at about that same width. Okay, let's keep going because this is a big quilt and we've got a lot to do. Okay, we're off kilter just a little bit. If you ever find that you're off, don't drastically swing it. It's a lot like driving and running off the edge of the road. You don't want to jerk that wheel back on because that'll cause you to lose control of your car. You want to slow down and slowly ease it back up. At least that's what they tell me. I think I've had that happen one time. Hold on tight. Okay, we're still going. Now it would be really easy to just quickly sew through all this and be finished lickety-split, but it's really not what we're after. And I find when I do that, I get further and further off track. And I am right now. What I'm going to do is my fabric is slowly inching its way out. So I'm just going to back stitch and cut it. And then I'm going to come back a little further back, join in where the stitching was. Back stitch, and now I can get it position back in like it should. And it's really hard with all this bulk to keep it where you want it. I find it almost has to go in at an angle to stay straight. Okay, there's our roll of binding still. Okay, we're having the same thing happen again. It's wanting to roll in on us. So I'm going to stop right here because there's another technique that I want to show you, and we're getting really close to the corner. So that's working on the corners and mitering those. So let's do a little bit of pinning, and I'll show you how this works. Okay, so we're going to want these right along the edge, just like we were going. A 1/8 of an inch gap here. And then the way they tell you to do this, or the way that I've found the most success in, is you come all the way out to the edge. And you're going to sew all the way. Let me grab a pin. I think I was using my other one the other day. We're going to use a pin, and we want to come in ¼ of an inch from the edge of the fabric. And I'm just going to put a dot right there on the edge of our blue. And then we're going to have it come in 1/4 from the edge. So we've got a dot there. That's where we're going to sew to. So let's do that, and then I'm going to come back and show you the next half of that. Okay, I'm right here to the end, and I'm going to sew all the way to that dot. And when I get to the dot, I'm going to stop my machine with the needle down, pivot it so that it sews right off into the corner. And I'll have to move my seam guide. Okay, and we're off the edge of the corner. Okay, so here's what that looks like. We sewed all the way up to here where the dot is, and then we sewed off the edge. Now, because we didn't line the fabric raw edge to raw edge, it looks a little bit different from what you would normally see, but it's going to work the same way. Okay, so there we go. We've got that. See where we are. Then we're going to swing this up to here. And now you can see that if we had fabric that continued to go that way, it was going to run right up along there. And I usually make a crease, and sometimes I even put a pin in right there. just to show me that angle. Okay, so we've got that. Now we're going to come down. We're holding that crease in place. And they say to line it up fabric to fabric, but I like to extend it just a little bit. Again, probably just in that 1/8 of an inch space. Remember, because we're not putting right ends to right ends. Or not right ends, raw ends to raw ends. Okay, and then we're coming back down the quilt top in a right angle, back at that 1/8 of an inch gap here. So that should work out fine for us. What we're going to do is we're going to come in here and sew right under where we were. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this out. And I'm going to pull all of this up here. So now when I sew, I can do the same thing I did before. Come in right at the center. I can see where my seam is right there, and then sew down. I'm going to sew to here, and then I want to show you what that looks like. Because if you get the first one, you should be able to get the other 3. They're all the same. Put our seam guide back in place. Well, no, let's stitch first. From the corner out. I need to pull that pin out. Sorry about that. Put my fabric down, put my needle down in my fabric, making sure I didn't catch that other fold. And we're going to sew in. Okay, that should be plenty. Yes, it is. Seam guide back in place. Press our foot down. Okay, let's sew and see how this works. The good thing is we've got such a normal stitch that if it's not quite right, we can take it out. And I'm going to sew down about 6 inches. Okay, let's see what our result is. I think I just lost my seam ripper. Okay, so here's our first seam, and when we roll this over, that's what it's going to look like. Now on this one you can tell the little binding on the back is going to be smaller than the binding on the front, but I think that's going to look really nice there, don't you? Okay, and then let's go on this side and roll it as well. Okay, now back to the corner. So here we are. We've got the seam going here and out, and then we've got the seam coming here and in. And we've been successful in not catching one under the other. So let's get some I got a few clips in here. We'll see what we have. Okay, we clip there. We're working our way to that corner. And then when we flip the corner, one of these is going to sit right inside of the other. And when we pull it, we've got a nice mitered edge. Now the question is, what's it going to look like on the back side? Now one of the reasons I like to do, well, the main reason I like to hand bind it is because I enjoy it. The second reason I like to hand bind it is because I can really take my time and sew those corners so that the seams in these binding areas match up perfectly, or as perfectly as I can get them. So that's what that's going to look like. Now we're going to need to stitch that down, but you can see there we have a nice mitered edge, an even full binding, and on the back side the same thing as well. And when I do this, I will put a little invisible stitch all the way up to the corner. It's a nice puffy corner, but it is an angle. It's not a rounded, pulled, stretched fabric. So that's going to be nice. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to quickly go ahead and bind the whole thing, and I will come back when it's time to join the edges. Now we're on to finishing up this binding. I've sewed all the way around it. It really didn't take near as long as I even thought it would. I thought it would take maybe an hour, and it probably took about 15 minutes because it's just real straightforward. What I have done is I've brought these out and I've overlapped them. And what we need to do is we need to overlap them at least 3 inches, which is the width of our binding. And we're going to sew, we open this up, this is where they meet, and we're going to sew a 45-degree line from here to wherever that 45-degree line meets. And where is that 45? There it is. Okay, that's right there. Line that up, make sure our fabric is straight. I'm sorry if you can't see this real well over here. There we go. So we've got that. Now, we've been sewing these strips together with the binding being perpendicular. So we're going to do the same here. So we need to sew this one on here. And we need to sew it, I think what we need to do is that's the furthest spot out. So we're going to draw this line, and I think I'm going to have to, I need just a little more space. I'm not quite accustomed to doing it this way yet. I've done it a couple of times and it's worked pretty well, but I need a little more room. But I think it should be like this. And that's the fold. And that's perpendicular. You know what we're going to do? Like I say, if you're not sure, and we certainly don't want to cut this too short, because if we cut it too short, then we're going to have to make more binding, sew it back on. We're going to have another unnecessary seam in it. Okay, so I pinned it here where I think it should go. And then if I pull it appropriately, that's going to do it. It's a little loose though, so we're going to tighten it up just a little bit when we sew. But we're going to sew from one corner to the other. And I know there's some great YouTube tutorials out there on this. And clearly this is not my area of expertise. So if you're interested in learning that a little better, go out there and see if you can find one that works for you. Okay, we're using the same thought process that we did to join the strips originally. And we're going to sew a 45-degree diagonal seam across the two X'd pieces. I'm going to make my stitch kind of big because we're going to consider this a basting seam. Okay, let's see. Okay, we've got those little basting seam in there. Let's take it out and see what we've got. I want you to see too. Okay, that is exactly what we need. It's a little too long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and put another seam about a generous 1/4 of an inch away. And I'm confident enough that that's going to be right, that I'm going to use a regular size stitch. But I will need to take these pieces apart so we can reposition them. Because if you stitch it without moving the seam, they won't be lined up. Okay, we can see where the seam is there because of the holes. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pin those two pieces together so I'm not fighting them. Okay, there's the one. There's the other. And we're going to move it down about a 1/4 of an inch. Right there. I'm going to get my needle down, and then I'm going to line up the other side. About a 1/4 of an inch. Okay, and adjust my stitch length. Now, let's keep our fingers crossed that this did it. Not too bad, 2 little tries. Kind of a trial run and then a real stitch there. Okay, so now let's ignore those for a minute. And look at there, we've got it. And we've got it just about the right length as well. So we're going to go ahead. This was a real stitch, not a basting stitch we put in. So we're going to trim that just past the seam. Get rid of those little tails. And while we're at it, we're going to go ahead and sew it and put it in place. I'm going to back stitch on the beginning and the end of that to hold those in place. You might want to tuck down that seam because it didn't get pressed, remember? Okay. tack it down, and our binding is on. That's all there is to it. A little bit of struggle there, getting them joined up. Where is that? That's right here. And when we roll that over, that's our joined edge. Perfect. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand stitch this down, and then I'll come back with a final review of everything we've done. We're going to wrap it up really, really quickly, and I want to show you the whole thing. We're back. Now, full disclosure, it has been a couple of days since we were filming on the video just when you left us. But in that time, I have been able to hand stitch down the binding on our quilt. And as you recall, we machine stitched it on the back and then rolled it over to the front, and that's where I hand stitched. I did take a small measuring stick or ruler grid and made sure that our distance here in our little border did stay consistent. It's about 1.5 inches from the stitch line here to where the binding comes in. I really love the binding for this. It was a great choice because it's almost solid, but it's not quite solid. And it kind of keeps in with the green that we're using here. We're repeating it here in the little berries. And it goes well with everything. I'm very, very happy with it. It was an easy pattern to follow. It went together really quickly, and it definitely says the holidays. I'm super happy with it. I would definitely recommend this pattern, this block, and this setting for a phenomenal quilt for the holidays. The other reason I like it is there's a lot of cute quilts in here, but a lot of them are kind of what I would call a novelty kind of design, and something that perhaps 5 years from now may not be in fashion or the thing to do. Whereas something like this is more of a traditional quilt pattern, but it's not so stuffy that it looks like grandma's quilt. It does look modern and fresh. I think because of the colors as much as anything. So it will, I think, stand the test of time. And when you're making something that you're only going to use for a short period every year, but you intend to use it for many years, that's what you're looking for. It has been a blast to make it. I've really enjoyed moving through this project really quickly. It's been a lot of more work for me because I've got to grind through it a little faster to be able to get it videotaped and edited and put out in a quick fashion for you. But it has been something that I've really enjoyed, and I'm thinking of ways that we could use this same process in a quilt for 2025. So we'll be looking into what we can do for that. If you like this quilt and you've missed some of the episodes, this was a 6-episode series. Check on the playlist, Deck the Halls, and there you'll see all 6 episodes. The first episode description has a list of the book and the links where you can purchase it, and the first episode will also talk about our fabrics and our fabric choices. And you'll be able to see everything from start to finish there. And if you like this video, give us a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe and share us with a friend. The love of quilting is something that I think we should share with each other so we can all enjoy it. Thank you so much for joining me here. I hope you tackle this quilt. I think it will be lots of fun. I think you will enjoy it. And have a great holiday season. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.